Before you listen, if you enjoy the stories and want to hear more, then please consider subscribing. Most of you listening aren't subscribed, so please take this time to subscribe. Turn on notifications so you'll never miss a story and be the first to hear. You'll also be supporting me. Thank you. This happened while I was working the night shift at this huge warehouse. You know the type. The kind where they store all kinds of goods before shipping them off to stores or whatever. I've been working there for a few months, and it was honestly pretty boring and tedious most of the time. Just me, the forklift, and the rows upon rows of towering shelves filled with boxes. But this one night, man, I'll never forget it. Let me tell you what happened. Okay, so my shift started like any other. I clocked in, grabbed my coffee, and did a quick walkthrough of the warehouse to make sure everything was in order. The place was massive, so it took me a while to make my way through the maze of shelves and pallets. Once I finished my initial walkthrough, I hopped on the forklift and started moving pallets around, trying to stay on top of the never-ending flow of inventory. The night was dragging on, and I was starting to get a bit drowsy. You know how it is when you're working the graveyard shift? Everything gets a bit hazy, and you're never quite sure if you're awake or dreaming. Well, that's when things started to get really weird. I was driving the forklift down one of the aisles, and I swear I saw something out of the corner of my eye. It was like a shadow or a dark figure darting between the shelves. I slammed on the brakes, thinking maybe it was a coworker or something, but when I looked around, there was no one there. Feeling a bit spooked, I decided to take a break and go outside for some fresh air. I stepped out into the night, breathing in the cool air and trying to wake up a little bit. But when I went back inside, it was like the atmosphere had changed. The warehouse felt colder, darker, and more oppressive than before. As I resumed my work, I couldn't push away this sense that maybe I was being followed. After all, I kept catching glimpses of that shadowy figure out of the corner of my eye, but every time I turned to look, it would vanish. The whole place seemed to be alive with strange noises, creaking shelves, rustling boxes, and even what sounded like faint whispers echoing through the aisles. At one point, I was so freaked out that I dropped a pallet while trying to load it onto a high shelf. I quickly picked it up, feeling embarrassed and more than a little unnerved. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, but there was a feeling that something was seriously wrong. Then it happened. I was driving the forklift down a particularly dark aisle and I saw it again. That shadowy figure. But this time, it didn't vanish when I turned to look. Instead, it seemed to come closer, growing larger and more menacing as it approached. My heart was beating faster than usual, and I could feel the hairs on my body standing up. As the figure loomed over me, I could make out the vague outlines of a face. Pale, distorted, and filled with malice. I was completely paralyzed with fear, unable to move or even scream. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the apparition vanished, leaving me alone in the darkness. The next thing I remember, I was lying on the cold warehouse floor, the taste of metal in my mouth and a throbbing headache. I must have fainted from sheer terror. When I finally came to, I wasn't sure how long I had been lying there on the cold warehouse floor. I struggled to my feet, my whole body shaking with fear and my head pounding from the fall. I glanced around, half expecting the sinister figure to appear again, but there was nothing there. Just the endless rows of shelves and the eerie silence that had become all too familiar. I knew I had to get out of there, at least for a moment, to clear my head and try to make sense of what had just happened. I stumbled back to the break room, my legs feeling like jelly, and slumped down into one of the chairs. I poured myself a cup of coffee, my hand shaking so badly that I spilled some of it on the table. The rest of that night shift, I worked in a state of near panic, constantly looking over my shoulder and jumping at every little noise. By the time the morning crew arrived, I was a complete wreck. I knew I couldn't keep working there, not with that malevolent presence lurking in the shadows. I never thought I'd end up working the graveyard shift at a 24-hour convenience store. You see, I was always a bit of a night owl, so it didn't bother me too much. It gave me the chance to listen to my favorite podcast or read books. Plus, the store was located on the outskirts of our quiet little town, so there was hardly ever any trouble. One particularly slow night, I had just finished restocking the shelves and was about to dive back into the mystery novel I'd been engrossed in. It was close to 2 a.m., and the town was dead silent. That's when a car pulled up in front of the store, which instantly piqued my interest since it was so unusual for this time of night. A middle-aged guy rushed in, looking all sorts of jumpy and nervous. He kept glancing over his shoulder like he was being followed or something. I tried to mind my own business, figuring he was just having a rough night or maybe had one too many drinks. He grabbed a few essentials and headed to the counter. As I rang up his stuff, I couldn't help but notice his hands were shaking like crazy. He could barely keep it together. Again, I brushed it off as none of my concern and handed him his change. He mumbled his thanks and bolted out of the store, stealing one last glance over his shoulder before disappearing into the darkness. I couldn't ignore this weird feeling that I was getting. It was like spider senses. I tried to get back into my book, but my thoughts were stuck on that guy and his strange behavior. I had this plaguing feeling that something was off at that moment. About an hour later, I heard sirens in the distance. At first, I didn't think much of it. Sirens weren't that unusual, even in our small town. But as they got closer, I realized they were headed straight for my store. I couldn't believe it when 2 cop cars pulled up outside, and the officers stormed in, guns drawn and all. They demanded to see the security footage from the past few hours. My heart was pounding hard as I obliged, having no idea what to expect. As we watched the tape, I noticed that the guy from earlier was constantly eyeing a car parked just off screen. I hadn't paid attention to it before, but now that I thought about it, the car had been there when my shift started. The cops took down the car's license plate number and thanked me for my help. They didn't spill any details, but their expressions said it all. Something big was going on. After they left, I was so freaked out I locked the store's front door, even though we were supposed to stay open 24/7. The rest of the night, I felt like someone was watching me. The next day, the whole story came out. Turns out the jittery guy was a key witness in some major court case, and the car outside belonged to a hitman hired to take him out. The hitman had tracked him to the store, but lost sight of him in the aisles. When the guy made his escape, he managed to dodge the hitman just long enough for the cops to catch them both. I was floored by the news. What started as a typical night shift had turned into something straight out of a crime thriller. It was a chilling reminder that danger can lurk anywhere, even in the most mundane places. After that night, I asked my boss to switch me to the day shift. The peaceful nights I used to enjoy had become a source of constant anxiety. The whole experience taught me that the scariest stories aren't always about ghosts or monsters. Sometimes it's the unpredictable that's even scarier. So let me tell you about this one time when I was working as a security guard at a stadium. Now, I'm not usually the type to believe in ghosts or anything like that, but this one night shift was just, well, let me tell you the story. I was doing my usual rounds, checking all the doors, making sure everything was locked up tight. I started with the main entrance, double checking the chains and padlocks on the gates. Then I moved on to the ticket booths and concession stands, making sure the cash registers were locked up and all windows were secured. Next, I walked through the stands, scanning the rows of seats for any signs of trespassers or leftover trash from the day's events. After that, I made my way down to the field, inspecting the turf for any damage and looking for anything out of place. I even climbed up to the press box, double-checking the locks on the doors and windows up there too. After finishing my inspection of the main stadium area, I headed down to the locker rooms and storage areas beneath the stands. That's when I saw the door to one of the locker rooms was a bit open. I could have sworn I locked it earlier, but I figured maybe I just forgot. So I locked it and went on with my patrol. The whole night though, I felt like something wrong, like something was way out of place. The air kind of felt heavy and misty, and the shadows were just darker than usual. Even the silence, which I usually found peaceful, was now giving me the creeps. Anyway, I was walking around the stadium, and then suddenly, I noticed the lights on the field were flickering. I knew I had turned them off earlier, so I went to the control room to check everything out. Everything seemed fine, so I switched the lights off again and got back to my patrol. As I was walking by the locker room, I heard this weird banging sound. It freaked me out, but I thought maybe it was just some equipment falling over or something. So I went inside to check it out, but when I turned on the light, there was nothing there. Everything was in its place, as the noise had stopped. I couldn't figure out what was going on, so I just locked up the room and went on with my rounds. But the weird stuff just kept happening. Doors I knew I had locked were suddenly open, and I even heard footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. I tried to tell myself there had to be a logical explanation, but deep down I knew something was up. Finally, near the end of my shift, I decided I had to confront whatever was going on. I went back to the locker room, took a deep breath, and straight up asked if there was anyone or anything there with me. And you won't believe what happened next. The room suddenly got super cold, and I felt this gust of wind out of nowhere. The lights started flickering, and the lockers were slamming open and shut like crazy. I was terrified, but I knew I had to stand my ground. So I yelled out, demanding whatever was there to show itself. And then, just like that, everything stopped. The room went back to normal, and there was no sign of anything weird happening. It was like my confrontation had scared off whatever was haunting the place. I found out later that the stadium had actually been built near an old cemetery, and some people thought there were still spirits hanging around. I'd never experienced anything like that again during my shifts, but I'll never forget that night. It was hands down the creepiest thing that's ever happened to me.
Thanks for listening in. If you like these stories and want to hear more, then please subscribe and like and support this new channel. We have more stories for you to listen to.